Time for us to check back in with Dorie, Woman of the Mountains, and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous recordings, you can look in the description below for a playlist. This will actually be the last chapter of the book. There'll be one more reading, though, connected with this book, because at the end, after this chapter, there is an epilogue and an afterword, and I want to read those because they tell more about what happened after the book was over and just some additional information about Dorie and her family. So this part, though, takes place between the years of 1937 and 1942. In March 1937, we left Tremont for the last time. Pa wrote that we could move to the upper farm on Middle Creek. It would be nearer Fred's job, and the boys could do some farming. The activities around Tremont were almost over. Soon it would be dismantled and moved out as the park claimed the land. So for the fourth time, we traveled the narrow, crooked road into the hollow on Middle Creek. The house looked the same as it had the first time. The giant oak stood tall and serene by the roadside. I looked at it with envy. It never bowed in defeat, no matter how rough the times. Drought, storms, ice, and snow didn't seem to touch it. Why, I wondered. Then the answer came. Roots. Roots was the answer. It had stood in the same place and grown strong, sending roots deep into the earth while we had moved all over the mountains, even back into North Carolina. In the 10 years we'd been gone from this place, we had lived at Jake's Creek, Wildcat Flats, Stringtown, Mark's Cove, Sam's Creek, Pittman Center, and Tremont. Our roots were like those of a fragile flower that only lives one season before it is pulled up and cast aside. Fred and the boys planted the fields and tobacco acreage. Fred worked with the power company during the week, while the boys cleared the new ground, plowed, harrowed, and planted. There was very little talk at the supper table. Tired, aching bodies were soon stretched out on beds. When he felt like it, Paul played the fiddle before going to sleep. The fiddle had a hypnotic effect on Don, who was about a year old. One night, he fell asleep at the table while Paul was playing. His small head dropped forward on his chest, and he began slowly falling to the right. We caught him before he hit the floor. There was always a special relationship between Paul and Don. Everything Paul did, Don imitated. He shaved like Paul. He talked like Paul. He walked like Paul. And of course, he played the fiddle like Paul. Many times I'd see them coming from the fields with Don perched like a prince on the horse's back. Every time he saw the mare, he cried to ride her. Just after he learned to walk, he wandered away when we weren't looking. We called and called without an answer. Not knowing which way to look, we each went a different direction. I found him in the field below the garden where we kept the mare. There he was, his arms wrapped around a front leg, trying to climb on her back. The breath went out of me. If she moved, she could kill him. She seemed to sense the position she was in. Standing very still, she waited until I pulled him away. Then she jerked her head back and whirled around, galloping into the open field. The fierce sibling rivalry Paul felt for his brothers and sisters near his own age had mellowed. The hair-pulling, fist-swinging youngster was almost grown. He felt a fatherly sort of affection for the younger children. With Fred gone so much, he became a father figure to look up to and love. Although he worked on the railroad with Pa since he was 13 or 14, it never interfered with his schooling. He was almost through high school and had hopes of becoming an engineer. It was not to be, however. We were going to need his help to survive. The Depression and its after-effects left us almost penniless. Fred's work was temporary. When the power line reached Gatlinburg, he would be laid off until a new job was planned. The isolation of the farm bothered me. There were days when we didn't see anybody but the mailman. Everybody was busy trying to make a living. If the children were unhappy, they never said anything. They were used to hard work and being by themselves. About every 2 weeks, a peddler came by with his old truck full of groceries, an array of pots and pans, bran for the cows, a few dishes, and candy. We traded eggs, butter, chickens, and vegetables for sugar, flour, and sometimes candy. After seeing him put the chickens into the coops and then reach into the box for loose candy without washing his hands, I soon stopped the candy buying. Wrapped candy was still in the future. Years later, a Chattanooga candy company drove me crazy with a jingle that played over and over on the radio. I can still hear it today. It goes, "Stop where you are, buy a Brock candy bar. Brock is a dandy bar, a nickel's all you pay, B-R-O-C-K, buy a Brock today." For now, loose hard candy came in wooden buckets or boxes and tasted glorious to my children. The bell on top of the Williamsburg school called the children from the hills and hollows, much like the Oldham's Creek school had when I was a child. Williamsburg was still a one-room school. Not much change had taken place in this section of Sevier County. Charles and Edith went to high school in Townsend and Gatlinburg. Wayne and Dwight went the 2 miles to Williamsburg on foot. Flo would start school this year. They didn't like the prospect of being burdened with a sister. There were so many things to do, so many rocks to throw. Did they have to take her? Couldn't she just wait till next year? No, I said. She was going this year, and they were to walk with her morning and afternoon. Fred had bought her a mint green organdy dress and a pair of black patent leather shoes for Easter. This was what she wanted to wear to school the first day. Not that she even wanted to go, but if it must be, then at least she'd look pretty. The day didn't work out. When the mailman came about 10 in the morning, he said he'd stop by the school, and the teacher asked him to please tell Mrs. Cope to send someone to get Flo. She was crying her heart out, and it was impossible to teach above the noise. When I left, your little girl was out at the pump trying to wash away her tears. Thinking back to another time and another little girl sobbing in a one-room school in Waynesville, North Carolina, I knew what had to be done. I went to the field and signaled Paul to stop plowing and come in. He took one of the horses and started down the road to the school. Fall flowers were making their last showing on the sides of the road. Some things had changed in the hills. The chestnut trees no longer dropped their nuts to be picked up by eager young hands. A blight had killed them. The once proud and sought-after trees stood decaying and bug-infested. The Indians had mourned their passing most of all. Chestnuts were a source of food for mountain people. They were used in soups, stews, vegetable dishes, and desserts. Hogs raised on chestnuts produced the sweetest meat. Many hogs were fattened on them. Midnight, the cat, gently arching and rubbing against my ankles, brought me back to the present and the problems that were with us now. Midnight was a very special cat. He had shown up one day when I was shucking corn. Sleek and black as ebony, he pleaded for my attention. I gently tossed a small ear of corn at him, and to my surprise, he pounced on it and ate it with as much enthusiasm as he would a salmon. He loved raw corn. There were times he'd be asleep upstairs and, hearing me shucking corn outside, come to the open window and jump 2 floors down to get a fresh ear of corn. Cooked corn wouldn't do. It had to be milky fresh. It wasn't long before Paul came back up the road with Flo sitting in front of him in the saddle. She didn't like the horse. Once, when coming from the field with Don and Paul, she slipped off its back and hit her head on the bridge crossing the creek. She was out cold when Paul brought her into the house. Life hadn't been easy for her, growing up with 5 boys. They expected her to be as tough and rambunctious as they were. Teasing her was one of their favorite games. Reluctantly, she started back to Williamsburg the next morning. I expected to have to go get her again, but when the mailman came by, he said everything was quiet. One of the neighbor's young sons had extended a kind, understanding hand to her and made the whole thing bearable. It was a kindness she never forgot, and one he probably doesn't remember. His name was Luther Brackens. I watched our children growing up. Edith, who was going to Townsend High School, announced she wanted to marry Stanley Fox. She had known him in Tremont, where he had worked in the railroad machine shop. Stanley was the brother of Eula Broom, the schoolteacher, and Bernice Hedrick, who ran the Tremont Hotel. He was much older than Edith and was recognized as coming from one of the earliest and best families to settle in Sevier County. We were not surprised by her news. Stanley had shown interest in both our daughters at Tremont. Always the practical one, Stanley had taken the trouble to look me over and interview me before he proposed to Edith. He held to the old mountain saying, "If you want to know what your wife will be like when she's old, look at her mother." I didn't realize the significance of his visit at the time when he inquired about my health and disposition. He was interested in my cooking ability and other talents I held claim to. No doubt about it, he wasn't going to take any chances this late in life. Reverend Kurt Sutton came to our house to perform the ceremony. We all gathered in the living room. I sat in the rocking chair with Dawn on my lap, and the other children stood around me, wide-eyed and wondering what was going on. When the ceremony was over, I was left with 5 boys and 1 little girl. Wilma and Edith were starting their own lives apart from us. They had been born when I was so young, I felt more like their sister than their mother. In the summer of 1938, the power line to Gatlinburg was completed. Fred came home to face life without a paycheck again. He went to work on a WPA job until his politics were questioned. When he told them he was a Republican, he was told not to report back the next day. WPA was supposed to provide work for all men, regardless of their election preferences, but it became a political tool to manipulate the men chosen to work. Many men in Sevier County will remember and attest to this, while others will vehemently deny it. Political differences were never easily agreed on or resolved. One Depression job didn't seem too political. The NYA, National Youth Association, helped Paul cultivate a talent for wood carving and helped sell his work. The $11 a month from the NYA helped keep food on our table. Faithfully, he handed the money to me without keeping any for himself. He worked in Pigeon Forge and had a shop at home. Animals he had seen and loved became his models. His axe in a stump carved from one piece of wood attracted a lot of attention. A lady came into the Pigeon Forge shop and asked if he could copy something from a picture. The object she wanted was an owl carved during the Italian Renaissance. He carved the owl for her and one for me. They were so good that he was asked to carve 2 more for a clock base. The clock was to be given to Congressman Jim Nance McCord, who later became governor. When I looked at the delicately carved owl on the wall, I marveled at the talent and patience that had brought it out of a block of wood. Where had he learned to carve like that? He was so young and had worked so hard, there had been no time to develop fine artistic skills. Fred and the boys raised tobacco that summer. It would bring in money for winter food and clothing and a few apples and oranges for Christmas. Late in November, they took it to the warehouse in Knoxville. Paul caught the red measles. He was over them before all the rest of us took sick. I hadn't had them, so I was in bed with 6 of my children. Charles was very sick. Delirium and high fever lasted 2 days before his red spots appeared. Ma brewed herbs into a tea and forced it through his clenched teeth. Within hours, angry red blotches covered him. Once the measles were on the outside, his fever went down and he slept peacefully for the first time in days. We had been so worried about Flo having any kind of illness because of her cough left from the flu in Tremont that we tended to neglect the others while watching for symptoms in her. However, she only had a mild case. She sat up in bed and counted the red spots on her hands and arms, complaining constantly because she couldn't get up and play. Ma finally let her up so she could take water to the rest of the fevered group. Ma and Pa came to take care of us. Ma said she'd never seen so many sick people at the same time. She held to the ideal that if measles were around, you should expose yourself or the children to them and get them over with once and for all. I had protected my children, and here we lay expecting her to look after us. It seemed to reinforce her belief that 1 or 2 in bed at a time is better than having 6 red-spotted, complaining folk to tend all at the same time. My children had all the usual childhood diseases here: mumps, measles, chickenpox, and whooping cough. The isolation of the mountains had protected them from the ordinary viruses. Croup and pneumonia were about the only things we worried about. Flu-like epidemics swept through the mountains, but measles and mumps were rare. Christmas was miserable. None of us felt like eating or moving about. Since Mrs. Townsend had brought a new kind of Christmas to the children in the camps, we could no longer ignore it or restore it to its puritanical state of earlier days. No, Christmas was with us to stay. At times, when there was no money, it caused a heaviness in the heart to see the sad faces of the children who faced the day without games or toys. I managed to bake Fred's favorite orange cake and a chocolate cake for the children. Edith and Stanley brought Flo a doll. The boys had no gifts. Fred was called back to the power company in the spring. This time they promised long-term employment. We could begin to free ourselves from the tentacles of the depression that held us in poverty. Money had been almost non-existent. If we could get our hands on some, we knew it would have great buying power. We'd long remember that a nickel had bought a loaf of bread, a can of sardines, a can of Bruton Snuff, or a big bottle of Coca-Cola or Royal Crown. Carbonated beverages were known to us as dope in those days. 35 cents bought a blue work shirt, and 98 cents bought a pair of overalls. Bacon was 10 cents a pound, and a 24-pound bag of flour cost 55 cents. Kerosene for our lamps was 10 cents a gallon. So when you hear that old Depression expression, "Brother, can you spare a dime?" remember that 10 cents bought you a pretty good meal. The relief of having a regular paycheck was overwhelming. Pride and belief in ourselves returned. A paycheck is tangible evidence of your worth and your talents. For a man like Fred, work was essential. Since he was 12 years old, he had given a day's work for a day's pay, never asking for anything he didn't earn. We learned there are two kinds of tired. A man who is tired from working all day and can show something for his labor sleeps well at night. A man who is tired from working all day and whose striving produces nothing sleeps fitfully. So the weekly paycheck meant more than food on the table and clothes on your back. It relieved self-doubt, frustration, and despair. With money coming in, Paul was free to return to school. He was so much older than the other boys who were graduating, the thought wasn't pleasant. Someone told him about the Alvin C. York Institute in Jamestown, Tennessee, where young people of all ages went if they needed financial assistance in completing their education. The institute had been built with money supplied by Alvin C. York, the great Tennessee hero of World War I. A movie had been made about his life, and he gave money to build the school. It was in Middle Tennessee, miles away from Middle Creek. The prospect of having him so far away from home worried me, but he would only be gone 1 year, and he deserved the chance to make up the time he gave to his family. As it turned out, he was still the oldest boy graduating from Jamestown. His classmates called him Pappy. He was the ripe old age of 22. In the spring of 1938, the last tree was cut by the Little River Lumber Company. Spruce Flats Branch was the site of the last fallen tree. The end of an era had come. Once again, the mountains were silent. No trains, no skidders, no portable housing stuck on the hillside. Tiny seedlings would grow over the scars left by man. The only sounds would be rushing rivers, singing birds, and at night the piercing scream of the panther, just as our ancestors heard them many years ago. The lumber companies had opened the door to the outside world. We became aware of things that money could buy, things that made life easier or harder, things to see, things to do. Our isolation had ended. They had opened a door we were forced to use as an exit from our ancestral homes. Then, after the exit, the door was closed to us. We were given visitors' rights to the land, to come and look, but not to stay. Soon we would leave this place of rolling hills and sturdy oak, too. Fred wanted us in Knoxville with him. I had to wait for the birth of our 9th child before we left the shadows of the hazy blue mountains. On October 3rd, 1939, our daughter, Sylvia Jean, was born. Sylvia wasn't a mountain name. I had read a story with Sylvia as the heroine. It was a beautiful name for a beautiful daughter. Ironically, Dr. Bruce Montgomery delivered her. Fred had walked to Gatlinburg to get him to come. He had delivered my first 2 babies high in the Smokies, and I suppose it was appropriate that he deliver the last one born in the foothills. In 1939, we left Middle Creek for the last time. It had been a refuge in times of trouble, a place we knew we could return if our hopes and dreams faded and fate dealt cruelly with us. It was there, nestled in the rounded hills, waiting. So that's the end of the book. As I said, there's an epilogue and a afterword that I will read next week, or next Friday, to kind of see what happened to Dorie's life after the part that we just read. Kind of gives more insight into the details of her life once the book ended, the rest of her life. A lot of things in this last chapter I enjoyed just as much as the rest of the book. As the book went on, her life kind of calmed down, which is usually what happens to most of us as we get older. I love that it started in 1937. That's when my daddy, Pap, when he was born, 1937. So I like thinking about Dorie and her family in comparison, not too far from where I'm at. She was in East Tennessee and I'm in Western North Carolina. Some distance, but still knowing that their lives were very much the same. The general area was very much the same, from the food that they ate to the words that they said to even those influences of outside influences that were coming in. All of those were happening here in Brasstown too, just like they were where Dorie was at. The sadness of the chestnut tree, as she said, it hurt so many people. Of course, the Cherokee Indians, but also everyone. My father, Pap, he's told me lots of stories about my Papa Wade when he was a boy, long before this, that how they depended on the chestnuts and how just prolific they were. Papa Wade said that you could just walk down maybe there was a road and there was a bank and the chestnut trees were there, and where they would fall off, you could just walk down there and fill up your sacks as you went. People ate them, animals ate them, and then they used the wood to make things out of, and then for warmth, to cook their food on, all those things. So the chestnut trees provided so much to all the people who lived in the area where they grew. And because they were so prolific, chestnut trees, even when the blight had happened by the time Pap was big enough to be out and about by himself in the woods, but he would see chestnut wood last a long, long time. That was another reason it was such a valuable tree to have. And he told me lots of stories of being way back in the mountains hunting or doing something, and he would see an old chestnut tree, and he said by that point they were white looking and kind of, strange in the rest of the woods, and he always thought of them that they looked like a ghost kind of shining through the trees, which they were. They were a ghost of what had once been. I loved the little part about Paul playing the fiddle and Dawn falling asleep at the table. That would have been handy to have when you had kids, if they, when they're little and you're trying to get them to take a nap or put them to sleep. If every time they heard a fiddle, they fell asleep, that would almost be worth paying somebody to come around and play the fiddle. I liked the part about Flo crying at school too. Like Dorie said, it reminded her, that's how, if you remember back at the beginning of the book, how when they sent her, they thought they were helping her by sending her to her grandparents in Waynesville to get to go to school, but she cried so much that they sent her home. So it reminded Dorie of that. It also reminded me of Corey. When she was I think maybe she was in 2nd grade, maybe 1st grade, it may have been 1st grade, but she went through a spell like that of crying. Every day she would cry. Now, she'd already been through kindergarten and did well, but for whatever reason, she just went through this horrible, and I felt so bad because I hated to leave her. And finally one day Matt said, "You know what the problem is?" I said, "No, what's the problem? Tell me, please." He said, she thinks you're giving her a choice, that there's a choice that she don't have to go to school. And he said, if you quit giving her a choice, she'd get over it. Well, he was right. I quit. I just started saying no, even though I on the inside was crying. No, you have to go, Corey. You've got to go and you've got to stay. And there's no reason to cry. You just need to get over it. And she did. That worked. Another interesting pet in this part of the book, Midnight, the cat that ate corn. I've never seen a cat that ate corn. Miss Cindy's cat, Yoda, though, he likes potatoes. He loves to eat baked potatoes, so I guess that's kind of the same thing. So all through the book, Dorie and her family had some really interesting pets. Kind of going back to the school part, I like that the mailman is the one that told Dorie about Flo crying. I just love that sense of community, and that they were all that close, and it's kind of watching out for each other. I love that. And of course our world has got so modern and so big and so populated that that's gone. But I love that smallness of living in a community like that, where the mailman could, come and tell you, hey, I was just down to school and your youngin's crying and they want you to come get her. There's just something precious about that. I loved going to a school. I was fortunate enough to go to a really small elementary school and at Martins Creek, and I loved that my teachers there didn't just know me, they knew my parents. They knew that's a little Wilson girl. They knew my grandparents. And it was much the same when Corey and Katie was there. They would know that's Tipper's girl. She's crying and that's Tipper's girl. We need to get word to her that she needs to come get her. I love that interconnectedness and I know everyone can't live like that. People that live in large cities and go to giant schools where you lose that but that's just a wonderful thing if you live in a rural small place like that, where that people don't just know you as a child, they know your parents, they know your grandparents, they know your aunts and uncles, they know all about you. There's just a wonderfulness in that, and I probably identify with that a lot because the Appalachian culture is a familial culture. It is like that. We want to know where you belong in the family, whose kid you are, who's your aunt and uncle, what family are you from, who's your people. You'll hear that a lot, who's your people. So I really love that part, that the mailman was the one that told Dorie she needed to go after Flo. And then I love that Paul, he ended up getting to go. It was amazing about the carving. Man, it makes me wonder if I could find one of his carving. I'd love to know if they marked them or, the book says that they were sold in Pigeon Forge and Gatlinburg. I would love to have seen one of those owls or the axe in the stump. All those sound amazing. We love carvings. Brasstown carvings is mostly what we collect, what Katie collects, and then because of her great love and my mama working for the folk school at one time, I have a little bit of a collection, and those are wonderful carvings. But it really makes me wish that I could find one of Paul's. And I love that they called him, teased him about being the grandpa. Even though he was just 22 years old. Matt, the guys that Matt works with, he's the oldest, and they call him Papaw. He's not that much older than them, but they call him Papaw. And it kind of started because one of those funny things that happened. This has been a few years back. They were in Bojangles, I think is where they were at, getting something for breakfast or lunch or whatever it was, and the young girl that waited on Matt asked him if he needed the senior citizen discount, and that's all the men that Matt worked with needed to hear to start calling him Papa. Of course, it's all in good fun, and he has good fun with them, talking about how he might be a Papa, but how hard he can work. So but I like that part of the book too. So I hope you'll leave a comment and tell me, out of this reading, what's the things that jumped out at you, what are the parts that you liked the best, and then please do drop back by next Friday and we'll completely finish the book. Kind of be sad. We've all enjoyed being with Dorie. She seems like she was just the sweetest, had the sweetest disposition and the sweetest personality. Although as she got older, we have several examples where she was as tough as her mama was. Her mother was kind of gruff and stern, but so amazing with all the different things that she could figure out how to do, and the times that she saved everything from the cow to the kids. But Dorie, you can see that Dorie had that strength too, but she also just had the sweetest personality. So be sure to drop back by next Friday and we'll kind of finish up the book and see what happened to Dorie after this documentation, what the rest of her life was like.